Hey, I'm learning stuff over here. Young World TV.
It's Professor Jim Gelvin, and we are discussing the Middle East and U.S. involvement recently and just historically. So at some point, America decides that they will weigh in. How do we determine when we step in and how?
It's a good question. Because, for example, if you were really interested in civilian populations, there were opportunities to step into Bahrain, for example, in which protesters were shot, in Yemen, in which protesters were shot, 46 last week, for example, in one incident. So why Libya? Well, Libya is cheap and easy for us, as it is for the Europeans as well. When I say cheap and easy, I'm not talking about economic costs, because every cruise missile costs about $1 million, and we shot over 100 of them into the country. Cheap and easy in the sense that Libya is not an ally of the United States. Libya is a fairly isolated regime. There's no love lost between Gaddafi and most of the world as well. We could not intervene, for example, in Bahrain because of our own strategic interests there. For example, we do have a base in Bahrain. We could not intervene probably will not ever intervene in Yemen for a variety of reasons. One of which is that outside the American South is probably the most heavily armed society in the world. But in addition to that, it is a very important player in the war on terror. There is a very active chapter of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is based in Yemen. And so we doubled, actually, our military support to Yemen in the last year. So we're not going to intervene in Yemen. We're not going to intervene in Bahrain. What can we do to demonstrate to the people of the Middle East that we're on their side? And the only way to do that, actually, is through Libya, which is a regime that is extraordinarily unpopular. Ever since the 17th century, there was this idea that sovereign nations can do whatever they want within their boundaries. And the very famous sociologist once defined a state as that organ that has a monopoly on violence within its society. Well, beginning at the turn of the 20th century, sovereign privileges have been whittled down piece by piece by piece. And most recently, there has become something called responsibility to protect. The idea is that states not only have rights, right to sovereignty, right to independence, right to intervening in its own internal affairs the way it wants to, but also has a responsibility towards their populations. This right to protect came out of the multiple crises that began in the 1990s. Bosnia, Serbia, the Kosovo situation in Serbia, Rwanda, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And there was this attitude on the part of many third world states that humanitarian intervention was basically intervention. It reeked too much of imperialism. It reeked too much of the West going in and meddling in their own internal affairs.
Yeah.
What began to happen, though, was a redefinition, because you have these two seemingly opposed viewpoints, okay? Number one, the idea that we can't have another Rwanda. Number two, the idea of, yes, we don't want another Rwanda, but it's none of your damn business, because what you want to do is pick and choose where you're going to intervene. You can intervene militarily anyway. This notion of responsibility to protect guarantees pretty much both sides some sort of compromise. For Western interests, who would prefer to avoid another Rwanda or Kosovo or whatever, it ensures that they have an international legal right to intervene if a state is moving against its population. For third world leaders and leaders that are not with the West, particularly Russia and China, it has the notion of a series of steps that can be taken by countries before they would intervene militarily, starting off with perhaps sanctions or starting off with severe warnings, moving on, escalating slowly so that military is just one option among multiple options on the one hand, and it's taken at the end of a series of escalating steps.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that has been invoked in Libya. And this is actually only the second time right to protect has been invoked in history. It was passed by the Security Council very, very recently in 2005, I believe it was, of the United Nations, which means that all UN members are bound to observe this notion. It is part of international law at the present time. So these are the two ways in which the balance is being maintained.
I find that tension really fascinating.
Oh, really, John Henry? What do you know? Stay tuned as Professor James Gelvin answers a few more of my questions for Young World TV.